We're in the Adelaide Hills. Yesterday it was in the high 30s, and today it is in the low 20s. So we're not as concerned about fire warnings. It's a much more serene day to be having a recorded conversation with my dear friend Olenka, who it's been 6 years since we were last together. And Olenka is also Canadian, so we share this cultural background, but are both from immigrant families who had transplanted to find a better life in Canada. And now we both find ourselves in Australia. And it's just funny how that can happen. Life moves you in a lot of unexpected ways. And when Olenka moved here 7 years ago, I did say at some point that I wanted to reunite. I did not anticipate that it would be under the circumstances of my also living in said country. The journey that brought me down here was one inspired by wanting to spend the holidays, or holy days as they're known, with people who really see me. And in a foreign land, that is such an important experience. So when I was debating flying back to New Zealand, the place that I called home for the last 2 years, it didn't feel right. And I sat with that for a bit, and I went, I've actually got somebody here close enough that I can drive there. And when I asked Olenka, how would you feel about my coming and spending Christmas with you and your people, I was invited not only to spend English Christmas, but also Ukrainian Christmas, which is called Siat Vecher. And I had the most incredible time being folded into community through the procession and preparations for a feast and a celebration of the holiest night of the year, which in the Gregorian calendar is January 6th, which is Christmas Eve, and then the 7th is Christmas Day. We both come from ancestry that celebrate on that day, as opposed to the 24th and the 25th. What a blessing and a privilege for me to have the experience of what it's like to be woven into a cultural reconnection with one's dead. And we both come from a background, having been scholars of the Orphan Wisdom School, of what it's like to rekindle our relationship with our dead. Given that, I would love to invite Olenka to not only share a poem of hers, because she's an incredible poet and performer, but also to speak on belonging and what it is to be a stranger in a strange land. The poem that she's going to be reciting for us today is called Mountain Ash, and I'm particularly partial to anything about mountains, since my name means woman of the mountains in Armenian. So without further ado, I will hand it over to you, Olenka. And if there's anything you'd like to say before reading the poem, please feel free.
Yeah, Mountain Ash was written in August of 2025, about 2 days after returning home from an unexpected journey back to Canada to be with my dying Baba, my grandmother. And it was written just up the road here in the Adelaide Hills, while sitting in contemplation in a wetlands. Mountain ash dangles above the open window of the motorhome I'm waking in, reminding me of this familiar place I call home. I cry at the beauty of its red berries, an old friend. I used to huck those berries at kids down the street amidst childhood games, not knowing that her sight alone would make me cry in a forward-moving nostalgia 28 years later. And just like that, 30 hours, 2 layovers, patiently seated, hurtling through space and time 30,000 feet above the earth, I'm in an opposite season. Being bitten by ants and being met by the calls of birds whose names I do not know. Surrounded by trees whose names I'm still trying to learn. They are beautiful, no doubt. but I do not weep to them as old friends do, and I am home, but not the one that's in my bones. A foreign human in a foreign land, I remain 7 years in, craving a smell that sends a ricochet of childhood memories flashing through my mind. It is an unsettling thing, calling two countries home. I cry for both, for the belonging and the displacement, and for that mountain ash whose red, buried branches sway in my absence.
There's so much in that poem that really resonates with how I felt first coming to this incredibly beautiful and exotic to me place where the flora and fauna are completely unrecognizable. I would love to hear you speak more on the experience of home, given the fact that it now lives in more than one place for you.
Yeah, sure. You know, it's a tricky one. It took me quite a few years before the term home was being used for Australia. You know, for those first few years, anytime I said home, I was referring to Canada. And slowly but surely over time, as you start to settle and know a place and be known by a place and know its people and be known by its people, that term, you know, I'd say home and then I'd clarify which one I mean. And eventually, I guess, I started to use both terms, and my parents would even tease me on the phone. Home? What do you mean home? You know where home is. Well, we're in home. You're not in home. But actually in July of 2025, while I was home, I was in the changing room at a pool with a really good friend of mine, and she reflected back to me that I was using the term home interchangeably. She's like, hey, just letting you know, you just said home for Australia, and then you also said home for here with us. I've never heard you do that before. And that was a real, I think, an eye-opener, a little bit of a floor shaker in somebody who's known me so well, being almost confused and perplexed by the fact that this place can be home too. And that's a complex thing. I think for anyone who's not living in their birth country now, there will always be a tether and a tie and something in your bones that you can't quite describe. The feeling when I said craving a smell that sends a ricochet of childhood memories flashing through my mind, that one is a direct call to lilac. I grew up with a lilac bush in front of my house, you know, and for a week or 2 weeks of every year, my house would be full of lilacs, and I love that smell, and it's something I really missed when I moved here. And it was only recently that I found one lilac bush growing at my friend's house. And every year this friend cuts lilac for me and brings it over. And without fail, I cry every time. And it's like you see the flash images, you know, I'm 7. I'm putting these janky little bouquets in my bedroom. You know, I'm 13. Mama has cut a bunch of them and is putting them through the house. And so those smells really do send that ricochet. It's timeless. Yeah. Smell is timeless. And you start to, over time, really miss, you know, the smell of wet pine after a rain and what it does to the soil and the smell of the needles getting wet. You know, that's something that's really rare to smell here. I'm now very familiar with the smell of gum. Gum leaves after it rains and the whole air smells like eucalyptus. And you go, oh my gosh. And I think when I move back to Canada, whenever that might be, I'm going to cry for the smell of eucalyptus after rain, because that also smells like home. So that kind of complexity of having one foot on each continent and family and friends and kin and babies on both sides.
Yeah.
I know some people leave and are really happy to have left and resettle somewhere and don't look back. I don't know if I envy them or I feel sad for them, but I haven't stopped looking back. I'm not sure that I ever will. And, you know, I have a lot of community in Canada to thank for reminding me of my absence and calling me back home. But I'm very much in both places.
Yeah, and I can see that in you and in the way that you're woven into both communities. Obviously, there is no forgetting, but there's also very clearly a tether. And your family still being in Canada, your immediate family, and your sister coming into a new chapter of her life, all of that, there's no way that doesn't impact your experience of home, no matter which part of the world that you're in.
Yeah, I have a really close friend who's European, and she lives here. And I think that there's a shared knowing that no one else fully understands. The first time that somebody dies back home, and you know that you can't afford not just the flights, but the taxis and the food and a trip to Canada is a minimum of $5,000. The time and the energy and leaving work and leaving your responsibilities on the farm, and it's a mass undertaking. And it's in moments like that I reach out to my other fellow Canadians living in Australia or my European friend, and you go, what do I do? Do I go home? And even though we know the answer is you can't, the grief can sit between two people because they understand the absolute heart-wrenching reality of what it is to not be there. My grandmother died and people say, oh, I'm sorry, my condolences, and that's it. Right. It's like, no, like, she's 96. She's the matriarch of my family. She was my last living grandparent. I've been on an incredible journey with her. And to have someone like that die and for you to not be there is beyond heartbreaking. And I've missed a lot of births. It doesn't make it any easier to decide where you are, and at the same time that deep surrender into, I know I'm in this country for a reason, and not all of that is made apparent to me, but some of the friends and people that I circle with are aware and can feel that we're doing something here. And so there's a sense of trust in that, but it can be pretty lonely.
Yeah, absolutely. In your sharing that, I'm remembering that the 2 times I left the Southern Hemisphere were for an almost death and a post-birth. Like the things that are the most important in a family's marking of time.
Yeah.
My aunt became really ill. Post-COVID, she ended up developing hemophilia, and her arms were filled with blood to the point where they were black. Like the color of her arms, they looked like they would fall off. And I immediately booked a flight to Canada. I went to my boss and said, I know I didn't ask for permission or approval, but I'm going to Canada to visit my aunt. And she made a full recovery. And I imagine some of that was her recognition of how loved and cared for she was. And despite Canada not having been my home for a really long time, it was really important to be there amongst family. And then I decided to fly back to LA because my cousin had given birth to her second child, her daughter Sophia. And I was like, I want to hold her while she's still a baby.
Yeah.
Even though she won't remember that, I will.
Yeah.
So that was really important. And then you realize that's just the way that it's going to be because this is where I'm choosing to put roots down. And given that particular word sparks a memory, I wonder if you'd be willing to share at all what it was like for you to perform and create I Am Root.
Yeah, sure. So I Am Root was a one-woman theater show that I wrote in 2020 in the peak of the pandemic when we were all still at home and I was recovering from endometriosis surgery and Ross River fever, mosquito-borne nightmare that you can get. All hail mosquito, the gods of power and force in a tiny pack of tiny punch. And I was bedridden and was just in a kind of a meandering of what it is to meandering as in a wondering really. I'm born Ukrainian-Canadian. I grew up speaking Ukrainian at home. I was embedded in an incredibly culturally rich Ukrainian community and diaspora in Canada. And when I moved to Australia, it was a pretty stark contrast. Lack of speaking my mother tongue, lack of singing carols, singing with other people, going to festivities and holidays, like just the whole thing kind of stopped. And I Am Root is me telling the story of leaving Canada, falling in love with an Australian, and the heartbreak and beauty of what it is to leave your cultural context and try to find it and create it in a foreign land. And so there's plenty of odes to kookaburras and gum trees and what it is to meet the wilderness and to work in the center of Australia in the desert and what it is to hold your culture when the context and the people around you can't support you in the same way. And that show ended up winning awards at the Adelaide Fringe and Melbourne Fringe, and came back to Adelaide Fringe for a second year, and performed it, in Sydney and a bit throughout Australia, and was such a coming home to myself. It's like singing folk songs and callbacks to my very small rural Alberta life, and a celebration of the Australian folks that have come together to help me celebrate Siat Vachir. Plays a pretty big role. I'm cutting beets on stage and, beginning the creation of borscht on stage, and talking about all these people coming to my house to help cook and prepare in order for me to have my feast day, and be surrounded by non-Ukrainians who understand and value the cultural work that is to keep it up.
Yeah.
So it was a pretty powerful thing, one, to create that, to tell that story and be witnessed in it. But more importantly, as I traveled across Australia, I met the Ukrainian diaspora anywhere I was performing. So when I was in Melbourne, I went to church, I went to Plast, I went to, and met all the, met a bunch of the Ukrainian community there. And of course, this is also while the war is happening. So there's newcomers across Australia, and getting to meet Ukrainian newcomers, and did that in Sydney, and have done that all over. And I Am Root almost called back out to my own to come and find me. And awards they mean something, but the most potent win of I Am Root was, I was at the Melbourne Fringe. It was my last night of the show, and I'm standing backstage, just absolutely nervous, because doesn't matter how many times you perform, those nerves kick in big time about a minute before game time. And the lights were low, and the predominant language of murmurs in the crowd were Ukrainian.
Wow.
And
I got goosebumps.
And that was one of those oh my God, I did it. I found them. They found me.
Yeah.
And, went through the whole show, and, took my bow at the end. I heard a lot more laughter and a lot more singing along. A couple of people sang along at various points in the show.
Wow.
Yeah, it was at the end when, they stood and clapped, and someone shouted, "Molodets!" At me. It's to be recognized by your own and seen by your own, and have their stories told. Yeah. A lot of them afterwards said, that's totally our story too. Right. You know what I mean? And the people that ended up resonating with I Am Root the most were people who have immigrated to Australia. Yep. A lot of Greek Australians, Italian Australians, French Australians. I had Iranian Australian friends of mine who were like, wow, oh my God, just transplant all the funky little Ukrainian moments in there. But that's it. That's the immigrant experience. You just told the story. And I think for me, if nothing more, being able to connect with others who've come from afar and can see themselves in that story, and can see what it is to have to cultivate your culture in an incubator that doesn't hold it. That's the win.
It sounds so fulfilling. I mean, even just being proxy by way of hearing the story, it really fills me with a lot of meaning. And I know you and I both know, as a result of having been scholars of the Orphan Wisdom School, just how valuable and important it is to reconnect with the stories and the songs of our ancestry. And most of the people who come to Orphan Wisdom School don't have the thread to pull on, really. They're either no longer in relationship with elders in their own family who have those stories, or they're just part of a Western cultural narrative that says you are something other than that now. And I realized when I was there, I'm not as much of an orphan as I thought I was, and I think you had that experience even more so than I. But this container of recognition that we all come from somewhere, and there really isn't such a thing as whiteness as we're told. You can't point at it on a map, you can't eat its cuisine. It's just this washing of culture and homogenizing of it. And when you talked about singing the songs of your people, I distinctly remember being in the back of a bus, traveling from Algonquin National Park, and you teaching the group of us that were in that bus how to sing a song that I don't remember the name of, but I really remember how joyful it was to be singing it along with you.
Yeah, we sang Tvita Tadin.
Okay.
It's an absolutely...
Oh my gosh, yeah.
It's a beautiful, beautiful folk song, Ukrainian folk song about love and grief. It's absolutely a heartbreaker, you know.
Oh
Although a lot of the
goodness.
folk songs are,
Yeah,
you know.
makes sense.
But I just actually wanted to pull on a thread that you had spoken to there. I recognize the majority of my classmates at the school probably didn't have a close, you know, lived regular day experience of connecting with their own ancestry, you know, whereas I grew up speaking my mother tongue and do know 50 plus folk songs just by way of having sung them with my community and family. Yeah. But, you know, I think something that always stuck with me about Stephen Jenkinson, you know, the founder of the school and someone that we've spent many an hour sitting and listening and wondering along with. You know, he talked about the consequence of, I guess, having a cultural practice is one thing, but if you were never taught with that cultural practice at the same time, the consequence of not doing it,
right,
then do you fully understand what you're doing?
Right.
And that really sat with me because there are a couple of practices that I didn't understand the consequence of not doing. Mm-hmm. I'd also never considered not doing it. It right. just is like, it's default. You just do it. But it had me wondering about how much I really understood about what's happening and where all of the absences of that exist in my practice. What alchemy is happening that I don't understand. And I am still a child of the Western civilization for sure. All of my grandparents are from Ukraine or from Ukraine. But I grew up in Canada. Mm-hmm. I grew up in a middle-class family in Canada. And so, yeah, I guess, you know, even, again, you know, earlier you were talking about, you know, whiteness, and it's really hard to put a finger on whiteness. But yes, it is a social construct, and it is also a privilege. That whiteness is a privilege, a hierarchical social standing of privilege. Right. And, you know, reading and always wondering about how best to understand myself in my cultural context. You know, I wonder about when Ukrainians became white. Mm-hmm. Because the stories of, you know, my father growing up in Canada, he wasn't white yet. Mm-hmm. That was really clear, right? Bullied they weren't allowed to speak Ukrainian in school, but they didn't speak English. They'd get, you know, the strap or whatever for speaking their own language. And they were the bottom of the barrel, right? And so that would have been late 50s, early 60s. And I really value, there's a podcaster named Blind Boy. He's an Irish podcaster, absolutely incredible, knows Irish folklore and history and colonial history of Ireland like the back of his hand. And he came to Australia, and I drove to Melbourne to see him speak, and he met with Tyson Yunkaporta, and they had a fantastic conversation about when the Irish became white. Right. And the privilege of when you are at the bottom, and then you are, you know, that cultural group is given the opportunity to rise out of the bottom by agreeing to the rules of whiteness. And so that's always something that I'm thinking about is, you know, at what point did Ukrainian people graduate into whiteness in the diaspora, and whether that, you know, I don't know when does that apply to newcomers. I don't know how that works. Right. We're all just trying to figure that out. But anyway, that was my tangent on whiteness.
Oh, there. Totally. Yeah, you saying that reminded me of a line in a book that I was assigned when I was in university and studying anthropology. There was an ethnography on Asian immigrants who came to North America, but particularly the United States. Mm-hmm. And there was literally just a little blurb on Armenians. That's all we got, because while we're from Asia, they must have graduated into whiteness a lot sooner than the people that we more typically identify as Asian due to their phenotypic expression. And it was just about how they did really well in the agricultural sector of Fresno. Wow. And that was... There we go. We've talked about them, and I was like, whoa, wait a second here. But their story is pretty different to a lot of other Asian immigrants. So I thought that was a really interesting contextual framing of just like, well, they're not being treated the same way that the rest of the immigrant community are, despite coming from the same continent.
Sure. And, you know, I'm also wondering about, you know, if there's only one paragraph. There's decades and centuries of life and lived experience in the way in which we can truncate something so complex into something so binary and simple, and a page flip, a paragraph of so much background and story that isn't there. And I think that was something that, I was listening again, Tyson and Blind Boy talking, and at one point Blind Boy was telling this story of colonization, and Tyson goes, hang on a sec, you just skipped a part.
Oh.
Listen to your story. So this happened, and then all of a sudden, what, this happened? Nah, something in that story, the line is broken. That's not the whole story. Right. I'm curious about what happened right there, because that part of the story is broken. And when we look at, kinship ties, and when we look at song lines, there's a break in that line there. That was a whole, whoa, hang on a sec, let's go back and look.
Yeah.
And so, I know for myself that a big part of my reckoning with the, things are often very black and white and presented very neatly in tight little packages. But in my adult life, it's required me to go back, particularly with the genocide in Gaza, to go back through my history and go, hang on a sec, very little about the relationship between Ukrainians and Ukrainian Jews is spoken about.
Mm-hmm.
But actually, it's a huge part of history, and the fact that that's not something I understand means my work and my time is to start going back through history and learning about the very complex and horrific experience of Ukrainian Jews in Eastern Europe, and the pogroms, and my work is to reckon with not just the shiny, not just the we've been colonized and invaded. Well, so is everybody else, and it's we're actively being colonized again by the same people. So there's hurt and harm there for sure. And also, what parts of history have we skipped over, and what are we not telling our children, and what are we not wondering about within ourselves? I don't think it's a coincidence that I happen to find myself living on a property with 2 Ukrainian Jews. The healing is nonlinear in the way in which we come to all of the information, whether that be the shiny side of your ancestry, or the colonial side, or the genocidal side, or the complicit side, or, fill in any blanks. Every history has a dark side, and I'm doing my best to process, face, acknowledge, understand, and talk about the parts of our history that need to be spoken about. That for real healing to occur, we have to all acknowledge what's actually happened.
Yeah, I really hear that. I think we could all do with, history research. I wouldn't call them history lessons, because you have to go digging to find the true history a lot of the time, since it's written by the victors. I know I've had a few conversations with people since moving away from the States about the kind of education that people get over there. And it's not comprehensive in the slightest.
Sure.
So recognizing that there's a lot missing in our understanding of why things are happening on the world stage the way that they are currently. I think it's really worth the undertaking of informing ourselves and using some critical thinking and asking the big questions.
Sure.
And potentially not getting the answers that we want.
Yeah. It's interesting you said the true history, and that immediately brought up for me, is there such a thing? And I don't mean to get super philosophical here, because facts are facts, right?
Sure.
There are some facts, like the ongoing colonization of First Nations people in so-called Australia is still actively happening. The incarceration rates, the police shot a black fella because he was holding a ham. You know what I mean? Like, there is just absolutely no ifs, ands, or buts about the fact that the colonial enterprise is still underway in most Western modern countries. And so I don't want to take that as a fact, for sure, unquestionably so. But, for example, I was talking about the Cossacks. Some people know them as the Cossacks. You think about those big red pants, and they got a funny haircut, and they got a sword. And, to the Ukrainian people, they're the freedom fighters. They were the tradesmen who rose up against serfdom.
Wow.
And organized against our oppressors at various points in history. And we know them as these complex, sometimes debaucherous characters who more or less liberated the working people.
That's incredible.
However, that's only one side of the story.
Right.
And this is when I say, what is true? Because when I speak with my Ukrainian Jewish landmates, they go, it's really interesting hearing you talk about the Cossacks, because we really see them as the rapers and murderers.
Wow.
Right? Like that in our history, they weren't so good. It wasn't so nice. So it's pretty jarring to hear you speak of them in this way, because, again, life just isn't so black and white, and right and wrong, and who they're fighting for and who they're fighting against. And there's different factions of people in history that had different belief systems, were ruled by different people or different rules. When I say true history, it's whose eyes are you looking through?
Right, there's not just one history.
You're looking at the same thing in the center of the room, but every person's perspective and their bias and their ancestry and their religious background, all of it changes how they see a thing. So, I guess my undertaking with Ukrainian history is to read it from every angle. What is it to read Ukrainian history from a Russian perspective? What is it to read it from a Ukrainian Jewish perspective? Currently, I'm reading a book by a New York Times journalist who lived in Ukraine for 14 years. Okay, well, that's a very Western, progressive, left-of-center narrative. What would a Western right-wing perspective say?
Right.
What would a Russian perspective, a Polish perspective, a Jewish perspective say? At least being able to look at history and understand that who's telling the story matters.
Right.
And that reading one book doesn't necessarily cut the mustard.
Totally. There are multiple stories that are intersecting at any given time. That's what makes up our reality. I personally, this might be controversial, but I don't really believe in an objective reality. If you exist in form, you exist in a fractalized experience, and there are multiple things happening at any given time. It's really hard to say that there is something objectively happening that is the same across all time and space.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think we disagree there. I think we're saying the same thing in different words, which is whoever's eyes you're looking out of tells the story, or the medium is the message.
Yeah.
We've heard that one. Yeah. What you see and what I see are different, and how we tell the story of what we saw will be completely different. And that's the work of poets.
Absolutely. That's why there's a poem on every episode of this podcast, because I really think that poetry can say what typical language cannot. It somehow transcends what capacity language offers us by using it in this mysterious way. I'll leave everybody with that. Thank you so much for giving us a lot to think about. And I can't wait to dig into history books as a result of the inspiration this conversation has given me.
Thanks for taking a second crack at our conversation.
Absolutely. Wouldn't have had it any other way.